Thank you.
Appreciate it. Well, I didn't see out there how many people were here, so now I'm a little worried. But I really appreciate this opportunity to be here, and thank you, Kirk. As mentioned, I did grow up in the small town of Snowflake. Many here have heard of it. But let me just talk a little about the burden of being raised a flake. Being raised in Snowflake, we had it pretty good. I grew up not knowing that flake was a pejorative term. Nobody made fun of us there, of course. But as I moved away, in fact, when Cheryl and I went to Washington, I was at a reception, one of the first nights there, and we didn't have name tags or anything, but it came up in conversation with somebody that I was from Snowflake. And this fellow I was talking to knew somebody from Snowflake. I don't know how, but he did, and he just struggled with the name. And for a couple of minutes, he was just trying to remember who that was. So I thought, I'll narrow it down for him. I said, was this guy a flake? And he said, nah, he seemed pretty normal to me. I thought after that, I'm not asking anymore. So since that time, I thought I'll have to go where it's comfortable to be a flake again. So the halls of Congress was a pretty good option for that. I've been asked to make a few remarks about U.S. foreign policy, particularly from the perspective of someone who sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But before I do so, let me give a little background as to what informs my opinion on foreign policy matters. As mentioned, I grew up in Snowflake, the fifth of 11 children, on a dry, dusty ranch. Not only was there no internet when I grew up, of course, but we had limited access to television. And my only exposure to foreign countries was a few excursions south of the U.S.-Mexico border. I was 19 years old before I boarded a large airplane. But I distinctly remember as a kid in our living room, sitting around with my brothers, listening to a man by the name of Alan Savory. He had developed a system of livestock grazing in his native country of Rhodesia, this faraway, magical place, it seemed to me. He told us how he used to fly his small plane so low that the giraffes would look down on him. And I just thought, that's it. And I was hooked on Africa from that time forward. And fortunately, since that day, my love affair with Africa has not abated. A couple of years later, I found myself on African soil serving a Mormon mission in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, of course, had just 2 years earlier been called Rhodesia. Zimbabwe is known for its elephants and its hippos, and to me, of course, giraffes that look down on low-flying aircraft. Most recently, it's been known, of course, for Cecil the lion, is where people hear about it. But after returning from Southern Africa, I found myself on a beach in Hawaii next to a beautiful girl from California. I introduced myself. She laughed at my last name. I got the last laugh there. A wedding, 5 children, and 3 grandkids later, that girl on the beach, Cheryl, is with us here today. I'm glad she was able to make the trip. Please do. Cheryl took on very grudgingly, I'm sure, my last name, but as a geography major, she shared my obsession with all things international. And after an internship on Capitol Hill, I went to work for a public affairs firm in Washington. We thought it would be a novelty for some of their clients in Southern Africa to have an employee who could speak Afrikaans. And 2 years later, Cheryl and I found ourselves in the country of Namibia, as Kirk mentioned, where we lived a political junkie's dream, to be there when a country has its first elections and writes its constitution. We were there for a 1-year period, and it was a wonderful time. So when I ended up in Congress in 2001, it was only natural to seek a spot on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and later on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I sit now. I frankly never understood the inclination of some of my colleagues to eschew all things foreign. Some of my conservative colleagues in the past have even bragged about not owning a passport. So I guess it shouldn't have been a surprise to me when, during one of my campaigns, an influential blogger noted disparagingly that Congressman Flake has, quote, been seen in the company of internationalists in Paris. I didn't quite know what that meant, that I had been to Paris, and I suppose it's better than being seen in the company of nativists in Toledo, but I'm not sure. But during my Senate race, my primary opponent spent more than $1 million on a television ad, and he called Flake Air. And he noted that during my time in the House, I had visited, and it scrolled down during the ad, 39 countries. I looked at the list, and I was incensed. I fired off a text to my opponent, and I said, "You neglected to mention Morocco, Lesotho, Iraq, and Jordan. I'll let you know if I remember any others." The ad was updated. Jeff has been to 43 countries. So I suppose they didn't consider that a plus in an election, but I certainly do. Speaking of travel, one of the first pieces of legislation I introduced was a bill to lift the Cuba travel ban. It has long bothered me as a Republican whose party believes in travel and trade and investment and commerce as a means to nudge countries toward democracy, that we seem to believe the opposite regarding Cuba. Plus, I took a poll among Cuban Americans in my district, and both of them said, "Move right ahead, we like what you're doing." But over the years, I've received a lot more support from the other side of the aisle than I have from my own on this issue. The Bush White House during these years, as you might imagine, was not too happy with my Cuba position. I remember during one White House Christmas ball that Cheryl and I were at, Karl Rove came over and motioned to me to follow. I followed him through a series of hallways and doors till we ended up in the White House kitchen. He said, "They need your help here," and left me there to find my way back to the party. But it's been a source of a lot of fun over the years. During my first time debating the issue, actually on the House floor, a Cuban-American Republican who didn't agree with my position stood up after I had made my pitch to remove the Cuba travel ban and said, "The gentleman from Arizona just wants to lift the travel ban so he can drink mojitos on the beach in Cuba." And immediately, a Democrat, David Obey, the ranking minority member on the Appropriations Committee, stood and demanded that those words be stricken from the record. And as it happens, then they stop the proceedings and read through what was said and slander you once again, I guess. But 15 minutes later, they went on with the proceedings, and I went ahead and got the amendment and actually passed it. But I went over to David Obey because I had never seen before and haven't seen since a Democrat stand up to protect a Republican in that way. I said, "Why'd you do that?" He said, "Well, Flake, I know you're Mormon. I know you don't drink. I was just protecting your honor." So I've always appreciated that. For my part, I've always felt that if you really want to punish the Castro brothers, just make them deal with spring break once or twice. That ought to be enough to make them just wave the white flag. But not long after President Obama was elected, an American, a USAID contractor, was in Havana, and he was detained by the Cuban government and then tried and convicted and spent 5 years in a Cuban prison. While he was in prison, it was impossible to move ahead with any significant policy changes toward Cuba. When I visited Mr. Gross in prison in Havana last November, trying to secure his release, he was near a breaking point. So when I received a call from the National Security Advisor a month later in December of last year, asking if I would participate in a sensitive covert mission, I hoped that it would involve Alan Gross. 48 hours later, I was on a plane taking off from Andrews Air Force Base. Along with me on the plane was Senator Pat Leahy from Vermont, a Democrat, and Alan Gross's wife. We took off at about 5 a.m. Following us was another plane that took off. It was to pick up a U.S. asset in Cuba, a man who had spied for us and had been detained and jailed by the Cuban government for 20 years. Another plane took off from Miami carrying 3 Cuban spies who had been imprisoned in the U.S. For a number of years. All 3 planes had to land at the same time at separate airfields in Cuba. I felt very much like I was in the middle of a Cold War era spy swap, straight out of a Tom Clancy novel. But we landed in Cuba. We were on the ground for exactly 31 minutes. We picked up a very happy American prisoner and watched that reunion with his wife. 20 minutes into the flight home, our pilot came on and announced that we were in U.S. airspace. Alan Gross stood up and threw his arms in the air and breathed deeply several times, saying that now he finally believed that he was free. We watched television live on the plane as it was announced that U.S.-Cuba policy would change and that the U.S. and Cuban governments would restore diplomatic relations. Now, just 12 days ago, I was able to return to Cuba, along with 3 Marines who, in 1961, 54 years ago, had lowered the U.S. flag over the U.S. Embassy in Cuba and had vowed at that time to see it hoisted once again. They had no idea it would take 54 years, so there they were in their 80s, standing and handing the flag over to the younger Marines to hoist it up again. It was a day that I'll never forget. There's a saying that partisan politics stop at the water's edge. I'm not naive enough to believe that that was ever completely true, but foreign issues seem to be more polarizing in today's political environment. Let me give you a couple of examples. It should be troubling to all of us that we are more than a year into our campaign against ISIS. This will be a campaign that, by all accounts, will last long beyond this presidency. Yet Congress has not specifically authorized this campaign with an authorization for use of force, or AUMF. Our enemies need to know that we speak with one voice. Our allies fighting with us ought to know the extent of our engagement and the limits of our involvement. Most importantly, our troops involved deserve to know that the entire country, and not just their commander-in-chief, is behind them. Now, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia and I have introduced a bipartisan AUMF earlier this year, but we've yet to convince our respective leaders to bring the legislation to the floor. Now, Congress needs to put guardrails around or limit executive authority here, so you can understand why the administration is not keen on pushing for an AUMF. But there's no excuse for Congress to not insist on it. And that's one area where we need to work on a bipartisan basis. Congressional authority has eroded over the years, particularly over the past several decades, but this erosion has accelerated over the past few years, partly due to just partisan bickering. In the past, Congress has very jealously guarded its prerogatives, particularly in the foreign policy arena, yet we seem far too nonchalant about forfeiting our abilities to weigh in on such important matters of war and peace. Now, when the Iran nuclear agreement was announced in July, I said that I would take the time to avail myself of every resource at my disposal to study the deal, to attend every hearing, briefing, classified and otherwise, that was available, and to seek out experts to consult. And that's what I've tried to do over the past month and a half. Now, many presume that because I didn't come out initially against the deal that I was leaning towards supporting it. It's unfortunate commentary on the partisan nature of foreign policy these days that taking the time to study an international agreement is not seen as performing due diligence, but rather as fence-sitting. Now, in my view, it's unfortunate that the Iran deal was presented to Congress as an executive agreement rather than a treaty. A treaty, of course, would have to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, thus ensuring a bipartisan outcome. A 2/3 majority, as you know, is a high bar, and the Obama administration is justified in its skepticism that Congress would come through. But we have passed treaties in the past, the last one being in 2010, the New START Treaty, and so it can be done. And with an agreement this big and this important, the terms of which take it far beyond this administration and perhaps the administration after that, it needs to be durable. And for it to be durable, it needs to have congressional buy-in. Already, some of the presidential candidates are talking about tearing up the agreement and withdrawing from it as soon as they take office if they are elected commander-in-chief. Now, as I see it, the nuclear side of the agreement is a net plus. There are tight limits with meaningful verification in terms of compliance. They're placed on Iran's ability to break out to a nuclear weapon that will hold them and limit them for more than a decade, and I think probably effectively. But let's face it, Iran has been a nuclear threshold state for some time now. If they really wanted to advance to the bomb, they could have done so already, but they've chosen not to so far. A more immediate concern to me is Iran's non-nuclear destructive and destabilizing presence and behavior in the region. Under the agreement, Congress loses its ability to impose meaningful sanctions to deter or to punish Iran for this behavior. And if the administration's current reluctance to challenge Iran's interpretation of the agreement is any guide, it will not want to challenge Iran's future behavior and its future adventurism for fear that it will give Iran a pretext to forego its obligations under the agreement on the nuclear side. This gives Iran leverage that it doesn't have today, and it tips the scale for me against the agreement. Now, if this were a treaty, the Senate could pass what we call RUDs, or reservations, understandings, and declarations, where we can clarify confusing aspects of the agreement, in particular, what Congress's role and what latitude we have to impose or reimpose sanctions. We have no such ability with this executive agreement. As an alternative, I've encouraged the President personally, the National Security Advisor, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, and most recently the Secretary of State on the way down to Cuba to work with Congress to pass parallel legislation in lieu of these RUDs. Legislation that would clarify the ambiguities and perhaps lead to some semblance of bipartisanship for this agreement. These overtures have not been successful. It looks as if, to me, that the President will have sufficient votes to sustain a veto near certain of Congress's near certain disapproval of the agreement. Should this be the case, the agreement will be implemented. And if it is, despite my own vote of disapproval, my efforts in the future will not be to undermine the agreement, but to try to help it succeed. It is in our national interest that this agreement succeeds. Now let me turn to an area that's an example of bipartisan cooperation, if a bit lopsided, for the good of the economy and the country. It's one of the primary topics that you're discussing today. That's the passage of the Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. Now, this legislation was very ably shepherded through the process by the senior senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch. And this authority, which will allow quick congressional action on the TPP trade agreement, will give U.S. exporters better access to hundreds of millions of potential consumers in the countries with which we have the agreement. Trade agreements matter a great deal to the country and to Utah. You all here know the figures. Utah's exports totaled $12.3 billion in 2014, a total of 3,494 companies exported from Utah just in 2013. Of these, 85% were small and medium-sized companies with fewer than 500 employees. More than 50,000 jobs in Utah are supported by exports. Now, those in this room understand all too well that with 95% of the world's consumers and 75% of the purchasing power outside of our borders, we can't afford to sit back and let the world move on without us. There's one other area of bipartisan cooperation I can point to on the foreign policy front. I'm fortunate to be chair of the Africa Subcommittee in the Senate, and we've held hearings this year that have drawn consistent attendance from members of both sides of the aisle who are interested in working to improve trade relations, improve access to electricity for Africans, and to look at best practices to stop poaching and wildlife trafficking in that part of the world. Last month I traveled with the President to Kenya, or as Donald Trump would say it, the President's birthplace. But we were in Kenya and also Ethiopia. It was a bipartisan delegation, 19 Democrats, and this Republican. But at least it was bipartisan. I had to chuckle whenever the president in his speeches down there would say, we have a bipartisan delegation here. But I was pleased to go, and it's an important region of the world, and as I mentioned, one that I care deeply about. But it's important that we look at areas like this where we can have agreement. Now, I read some tweets while I was there. Some of the Tea Party folks at home were saying that Flake is in Africa just to see his soulmate, the rhino, the Republican in name only type of rhino. But actually saw a few elephants, but no rhinos in that way. But in conclusion, let me just say that given the importance of bipartisan foreign policy, I'm always on the lookout for ways to foster it. And in some cases, I'm resorted to extreme measures, as Kirk mentioned with my island experience last year. In fact, last year, myself and Martin Heinrich, a Democratic senator from New Mexico, were on a tiny speck of an island in the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific with no food or water. We weren't even dropped off on the island. We were dropped off near the island and had to swim to it. The Discovery Channel had come along to film our exploits, which they later aired and they called Rival Survival. But it was an incredible experience. Let me just tell you, the coconut water craze is come and gone for me. That's, you can have it. It was no picnic. And survive we did, but barely. It was no picnic, and that no picnic I've ever been to has served up such inedible and gag-inducing raw clams that we were forced to eat there. On our return, we went on the Letterman show and did the circuit talking about how Republicans and Democrats can get along. And Stephen Colbert ran a clip of it. Well, first Jimmy Fallon did. He had a clip of me speaking in a hearing and talking to somebody, and then they panned over to a volleyball with Wilson taped on it. But I like Stephen Colbert's comments the best. He ran a clip of the show and he said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all that Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So it can be done. My hope is that we can forge a bipartisan foreign policy under less trying circumstances. Having a bipartisan foreign policy has served our country very well in the past, and it will do so again in the future if we give it more of a chance and make it more a priority. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to, I guess, questions will be asked. As long as they don't come from Lou Kramer, I'll be all right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Senator. That was fantastic. We welcomed Senator Heinrich to doTERRA on August 7th, and he told us a couple of your stories. That was unbelievable what you two did. So are you doing it again next year, do you think?
I can't say with my wife in the room.
Oh.
I'd like to thank Cheryl, but she says there needs to be a hotel on that island before she'll go. But it's not out of my system yet, but there are no plans right now.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, thank you. I'll ask the first question, and then I'd like to turn it over. Our pick in 2012 for President Mitt Romney said that Russia was the greatest threat in the world. He was derided. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars making fun of that choice. We then fast forward through the Crimea, Ukraine, all these issues to President Obama's top military advisor, General Joseph Dunford, nominee for the now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When he was asked, he gave Romney's answer. What's going on with Russia? How big of a threat? How manageable is it?
Well, obviously what they did in Crimea and are now doing in Ukraine, and some people believe that they may be doing in other areas of Eastern Europe is very troubling. Mr. Putin has certainly tapped into and taken advantage of Russian nationalism. Now, hopefully, that has its limits. given the Russian economy. We thought that that would play out more forcefully than it has with oil prices so low, but with the extended outlook for oil and the Russian economy being so dependent, the hope is that that will be a limiting factor. Part of the problem is too much of Europe is currently dependent on Russian crude and other energy, and natural gas in particular, and we can help with that. We have passed out of committee and have moved legislation to allow for natural gas exports that will ultimately find their way to Europe and help with their dependency issues. And if we really want to limit Russia's behavior without resorting to armed force, then we need to do it with tough and meaningful sanctions, and that can only be done if we have our European partners with us. So we're working at that, and it is a concern, and I think Mitt Romney was prescient when he said that, and a lot of people are wondering what it would have been like had we made a different choice.
Thank you. Anyone but Lou have a question?
Cheryl and I have known Lou for a long time, back in our days in Northern Virginia. So.
Let's see. Well, good. I've got, oh, wait, sorry. We've got one right there.
Okay.
What can the U.S. do policy-wise to limit the influence of the Chinese economy on the U.S. economy?
What can the U.S. do to limit the impact of the Chinese economy on the U.S. economy? Well, we've got a lesson this week on the interdependency of the world and our dependency on Chinese purchasing power. I directly, I don't know what we can do to prop up the Chinese stock market or its currency. I think part of the problems is their manipulation of currency, and some of the areas that they've gone into in trying to promote their exports abroad and make them more attractive abroad are now coming back to bite them. And I think we'll see this playing out for quite a while. You see a slowdown in manufacturing, certainly a slowdown in growth and construction in China, and then you have the long-term demographic problems that China has. It's still going to be a strong economy for a long time, but I wouldn't trade our demographics with China for anything, because they're going to face some tough times ahead.
Thank you. Next question, I saw it there, right there.
This is Doug Brunke, Global Chamber. Senator Flake, thank you for the interview last week. To continue the Africa theme and the elephant in the room, given so many exporters here, is your lack of support of the Exim Bank. You said last week 1.5% of our exports are supported by Exim Bank. Kind of doesn't matter. We have to let private industry take control of that, but 1.5% is a few thousand jobs in Utah. And so I think what you said last week was you're willing to lose a few jobs in the U.S. in losing the Exim Bank for the principle. Could you, for this room of exporters and people who care about exporting, maybe articulate why that's a good policy?
Well, you may believe I'm wrong, but I've been consistent. I've never believed this is an area that the U.S. government ought to be in. It does only impact less than 2% of all exports, so it's really on the margins. And in many cases, it does advantage some exporters over others, or some U.S. companies over others, and I just don't think that it's the federal government's role to make that position. My role, I believe, as a policymaker, is to create a conducive tax and regulatory environment for all business to flourish, and not to try to pick certain businesses or industries over another. I know that whenever government moves from one sector or out of a particular sector or downsizes an activity, there are dislocations, and I don't think that anybody would say otherwise, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen, and that's the way the economy goes. And so I would just say that there are good statistics out there about the value of it. If there is such value, the private sector will come in. That's the way the free market economy works. So that's where my response would be.
We have one hand here.
Cynthia Gibson, Utah State University. What does the TPP do that previous trade agreements have not done?
Well, it involves some countries that we haven't had strong trade agreements with, and so there would be tariff agreements that would make some of those markets more attractive to us than they previously have been. And it's one of the largest agreements. We have 11 countries involved in this, and so it's important just as a matter of scale. It's unfortunate that we can't just do bilateral trade agreements with countries, but the way the world works today, it's very difficult to get a trade agreement signed without a trade promotion authority as a way for Congress to backtrack it. It's not a popular thing for Congress to do. As I mentioned before, Orrin Hatch did an incredible job shepherding that through, but it's nothing that a lot of candidates like to talk about during a campaign, because with trade there are always dislocations. Some companies do go out of business, but on the whole, companies in the U.S. do better. And I think with regard to this agreement, the TPP, it's important in terms of scale. Many of these countries with whom we're negotiating this agreement, we already have some agreement with, but it will standardize some of those tariffs and agreements in a way that they aren't before. And so economists will tell you this is one of the most important trade deals that we've negotiated in a long time.
Thank you.
Simon Greathead, BYU. The perception of the United States, especially among allies, has changed over the last decade. What are your thoughts regarding how our allies and friends around the world perceive the United States, and what can we do to sort of change that, shore up that perception of friendship?
Well, thank you. I think a state like Utah, with so many individuals who have spent time overseas and come back understanding the culture and speaking the language, we could learn a lot from what Utah is doing, and not just the state, but institutions, universities, and other civic organizations here. But it is going to be difficult, and one of my biggest regrets about this Iran nuclear deal, like I said, that it wasn't a treaty, one that would pull people in rather than push people away from it, is that our allies are all, with the exception of Israel, on the other side, favoring the agreement. And it will be extremely difficult to put any type of sanctions regime back together should we need to do so. And so it's not a good thing to have on the foreign policy front what we've seen on the domestic front with a policy like the Affordable Care Act, where it only passes with a bare majority of partisan votes. It simply doesn't make it durable. And I think our allies are looking for us to be in there for the long haul. And so I'm not just critical of the administration here, but Congress, like I said, we've forfeited a lot of our ability to be involved just because of partisan bickering. And I think so. One thing we've got to do, particularly with institutions who have traditionally led in this regard at having a long-term foreign policy that will help put together, for example, in the Middle East, a regional security framework that our allies can work with us on. It's important for this committee to move ahead. And I think under the leadership of Bob Corker and Ben Cardin, we're starting to do that. We were able to pass the Iran Sanctions Review Act, giving us at least some role in this process that we had forfeited earlier on by passing sanctions legislation that gave the president a waiver that he could simply ignore. So that passed with just, I think, one dissenting vote. And so we are, I think, moving in the right direction, but we've got to move much faster. Thank you.
Anyone on this side of the room? There we are, right there. Yes.
What are some of the U.S. trade missions for 2016?
I'm sorry, some of the U.S. trade missions?
Yes, for 2016.
Well, obviously we hope to complete the TPP and then have that move through Congress. I'm not sure if that's going to be at the end of 2015 or 2016, but that really needs to be done. It's unlikely that we will be able to negotiate any more free trade agreements because these take a while to go through. But gratefully, this authority will last for another 5 years. And so the real beneficiary of TPA, or Trade Promotion Authority, was not this administration, but the next administration. And so hopefully we can get a jump start on that. With regard to Africa, I know we just reauthorized the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, which is really kind of concessionary trade policy, but hopefully it's going to help build markets there for our exports later. So we'll be working on that pretty hard. But in other areas as well, just take Cuba, for example. We exported about $300 to $400 million in ag exports last year. We have been for a few years. It's something most people don't realize that we're already doing. That could expand significantly in the coming year. But Latin America as well, one of the benefits of our new policy on Cuba, it allows us to engage in a more meaningful way with some of our neighbors and colleagues and friends in the Western Hemisphere that have not been able to deal with us because of our Cuba policy. So there are a number of areas that we can work on. And Mexico as well. Mexico is certainly doing better in some regard in clamping down on corruption. And for states like Arizona and really anybody in the West, I think for Utah, Mexico is the fourth leading trade partner. But that's a big market that can get a lot bigger as well. So thanks.
One final question right here.
Mark Bennett, Campbell Scientific up in Logan. Regarding the world-funded projects and in the United States, USAID funded projects, I tend to see, and we tend to see, a great emphasis on capital expenditures, getting the project, getting the equipment, getting it set up, and initially established, but less emphasis on support and maintenance and ongoing support to see that these projects and the effort and the funds and resources applied are successful over the long term. Just returned from Central Asia, where I saw unfortunate evidence of a USAID project from a decade ago that's just moldering away and of no value to anyone. Anyway, would appreciate your comment and thought and ideas on how we might implement ongoing support.
Well, thank you. And you tapped into a frustration I've had for a long time. If you look at particularly the significant monies we've spent in these war-torn countries, in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, some of it through USAID, that we simply put the money there and never look at it again. And this, the onus really has to be on Congress. We authorize these programs, we appropriate money for them, and we rarely go back and check to see what good the program has done or what we're doing. In some of the programs, the sub-programs, like the Millennial Challenge Account, for example, the MCC countries, we do check back because there are standards that have to be met. But with a lot of the USAID projects, we have no such look back. And so one thing that we want to do in the Foreign Relations Committee, where we authorize a lot of these programs, is have regular reauthorization and oversight hearings. And I know that some of that's being done in the House by people like Jason Chaffetz in the Government Oversight Committee. And he's traveled around and has some of the same concerns that you've raised. So I completely agree, and we've got to look a lot more. Some of this money can be used for much good. If you look at Africa, at what President Bush, the initiative PEPFAR, to help these countries deal with the scourge of AIDS, probably one of the most successful programs in the history of U.S. foreign aid. And it had not only alleviated the suffering and continues to alleviate the suffering of hundreds of thousands or millions of Africans, but it has bought the U.S. all kinds of goodwill all over the continent that helps us with security agreements that we have with Kenya, for example, to combat al-Shabaab, or in Nigeria with Boko Haram. And so these have knock-on effects and benefits if these programs are managed effectively and they're done well. So great point, and we'll follow up.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's give him one hand.
Thank you.
That was
Appreciate it.
fantastic.